Welcome to another discussion on the human nervous system. This time we will be talking about the synapse. To understand the synapse, we first need to know its structure. And inside the synapse, there is a substance known as the neurotransmitter. So we'll talk about the role of neurotransmitters, especially acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Then added to that, we will talk about the mechanism of impulse transmission across the synapse. So let's move on. Our nervous system is full of neurons. The neurons crisscross and communicate with one another, but they actually never physically touch. This is an enlarged view of what I'm talking about. Up here is one neuron and down here is another. And you see they do not physically touch. This is the axon terminal, which will then have a circle at the end known as the synaptic knob. And this is the other neuron where the circle here is the dendrite and below will be the dendron leading to the cell body and the axon later. But you see, between the synaptic knob and the dendrite, there is one tiny space known as the synaptic cleft. So, when we say synapse, synapse is actually the whole structure here. That is the synaptic knob, the synaptic cleft, and the dendrite of another neuron. So, what happens is an impulse will be transmitted along the axon until it arrives at the synaptic knob. We learned previously that the impulse is electrical. However, once it reaches the synaptic knob, the electrical impulse cannot move any further because the membrane here is going to prevent saltatory conduction. So what's going to happen is a chemical impulse will be generated using the neurotransmitters, which I will be teaching you shortly. And then that chemical impulse will once again start off an electrical impulse in the dendrite, which will then be transmitted along the nerve fiber. So this is the structure of the synapse. Now let's go into the detail of the parts in the synaptic knob. To do that, I'm going to use my simplified model of a synapse. The purple is the axon terminal with the synaptic knob. The cream is the dendrite. So there's a space between them which we call the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft is bordered by two membranes. The membrane of the synaptic knob is called the presynaptic membrane, and the membrane of the dendrite is called the postsynaptic membrane. Pre meaning before, so this is the membrane before the synaptic cleft, and post meaning after. So this is the membrane after the synaptic cleft. The membrane of the synaptic knob also have channel proteins. This is known as the calcium ion gated channel. You can also call it calcium ion voltage gated channel. Its function naturally is to transport calcium ions. Inside the synaptic knob, there are two types of organelle. The first one is the mitochondria, which will generate ATP. And we have vesicles called synaptic vesicles, which contain the chemical that is neurotransmitters. So that is the detailed structure of the synaptic knob. Let's move on to the detailed structure of the postsynaptic membrane. In the postsynaptic membrane, there are also channel proteins. That is the sodium ion gated channels that we studied for axon. Okay, we can also call it sodium ion voltage gated channel. Now these channels, however, are a bit different from those that are found on the axon because these sodium ion voltage gated channels have protein receptors on their surface. These protein receptors bind to the neurotransmitters specifically. So this sums up the detailed structure of a synapse. Next, I want to introduce to you the details about neurotransmitters. So let's carry on. This is a list of the different types of neurotransmitters found in your nervous system. Only the first one here, adrenaline, is not a neurotransmitter. It is a hormone. You will learn about this hormone under subtopic 9.2 endocrine system, where it is in charge of the fight or flight response. Okay, but I place it here because it's very similar to the name noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is a neurotransmitter. You can see its function is for concentration. As students, you need to have a nervous system that produces lots of noradrenaline, lots of acetylcholine, as well as glutamate. Because noradrenaline helps in concentration, acetylcholine for learning, and glutamate for memory recall. But I know as I'm mentioning this, you will be thinking at the back of your mind how to increase the amounts of noradrenaline, acetylcholine, and glutamate in your nervous system. Alright, but sorry, I don't have an answer for this. Right, so we move on to other types of neurotransmitters such as GABA, which gives you this calming feeling. You experience this like once you have finished your homework and you feel very peaceful, and that is because of GABA. Dopamine for pleasure. Pleasure here, for instance, like, you get to eat your favorite food, or you get to go shopping, or go for a movie, spend time with friends. That is dopamine. Serotonin controls your mood. There are days like when you get up and you feel very positive and happy. That is because your nervous system is producing lots of serotonin. But if you're in a very bad mood and angry with everybody, then your serotonin levels are low. Then we have another neurotransmitter called endorphins. Endorphins control the feeling of euphoria. Euphoria is like an extreme happiness, feeling like you are walking in clouds. This happens when people are in love, okay, or even when you are active in sports. After a good game of basketball or a good run, you feel very happy. That is endorphin. Right, but for our syllabus, we just need to know noradrenaline and acetylcholine. Right, so let's go on to what our syllabus wants us to know. That is firstly the meaning of a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers. What they do is they transmit impulse across the synapse from one neuron to another neuron. So the question is, how do they do this? How are they able to change an electrical impulse into a chemical impulse, then back to an electrical impulse? Look at the diagram. You can see the impulse is being transmitted as an electrical impulse along the axon, as you know, by saltatory conduction. Then when it arrives here at the synapse, we can't see it, but it is converted into a chemical impulse. Then when that neurotransmitter, that is the chemical impulse, touches the dendrite, it causes the permeability of the postsynaptic membrane of the dendrite to change. So when the permeability of that membrane changes, depolarization occurs. Okay, and if depolarization is successful, action potential will be achieved, and with that, an electrical impulse can be generated. And then that electrical impulse will be transmitted along the axon of the next neuron. So this is how impulse is passed from nerve to nerve. First as an electrical impulse, then briefly as a chemical impulse, and then continue back as an electrical impulse. The details of this process I will explain when we touch the transmission of impulse across the synapse. But now let me go on to the two neurotransmitters that you need to know more about. The neurotransmitters are noradrenaline and acetylcholine. Noradrenaline has another name, that is norepinephrine. Nervous systems that contain this neurotransmitter are the sympathetic nerves. Now, there's another name for the sympathetic nerve, that is adrenergic neurons. The word adrenergic coming from the word adrenaline here. So, noradrenaline's function is similar to the hormone adrenaline, that is during stress. So, earlier I told you, as a student, you need this neurotransmitter noradrenaline. So, one way of having noradrenaline activated in your nervous system is to feel stress. Okay? So, that means when you are stressed as a student, it is actually good. Right? Now, let's compare with acetylcholine. Acetylcholine doesn't have a second name. Okay? And you find that the nerve that will have this neurotransmitter is the parasympathetic nerves. Another name for these nerves is cholinergic neurons. The word choline coming from the word acetylcholine. Okay? And when do these nervous systems function? We see during your normal day-to-day activities. Now, both these neurotransmitters can be broken down by enzymes. The noradrenaline is broken down by the enzyme monoamine oxidase through the process of oxidation. Whereas acetylcholine can be broken down by the enzyme cholinesterase through the process of hydrolysis. So now you are familiar with the two types of neurotransmitters. We move on to the next part, that is the transmission of impulse across the synapse. To do that, I will use my model and we go through the process. Firstly, the impulse must arrive. The electrical impulse must arrive. When the electrical impulse arrives, this will actually stimulate the calcium ion voltage gated channels to open. So this will cause the calcium ions to diffuse in. This is not an active process, so ATP is not needed yet. Now, once the calcium ions are in the synaptic knob, the calcium ions will stimulate the synaptic vesicles to move down to the presynaptic membrane. Now, the movement of the vesicle requires ATP, and that ATP is generated by the mitochondria. Next, you see exocytosis will occur. That is, the membrane of the vesicle will fuse with the presynaptic membrane, causing the neurotransmitters to diffuse out into the synaptic cleft. Then, these neurotransmitters will attach to the protein receptors located on the sodium ion voltage gated channels. The binding of the neurotransmitter to the receptor will stimulate the sodium gated channels to open. So once the sodium gated channel is open, an influx of sodium ion will occur. So sodium ions will begin to diffuse into the dendrite, and this will start off the depolarization of the dendrite. The accumulation of the sodium ions will cause the membrane potential to change. So the first level of the membrane potential is called EPSP, short for excitatory postsynaptic potential. The EPSP will increase to reach threshold potential. And naturally, if can pass the threshold potential, action potential will be generated. And from here, you know, once we have action potential, an electrical impulse is generated and will be transmitted along the neuron as saltatory conduction. So that is the general mechanism of transmission of impulse across the synapse. But the story doesn't end here. The neurotransmitters must not remain in the synaptic cleft, because if they stay there, they will cause the same impulse to be transmitted repeatedly. This will be a waste of energy and a waste of time. So these neurotransmitters have to be removed. There are 3 ways of removing them. Firstly is by hydrolysis. The enzymes I mentioned earlier for noradrenaline and for acetylcholine, those enzymes can come and hydrolyze these neurotransmitters. So this is one way of removal. The second way of removal is an active process which requires ATP, that is called reuptake. So these neurotransmitters will be transported back into the synaptic knob for reuse. The third way does not require energy, that is by diffusion down concentration gradient. So you see the neurotransmitters will diffuse out of the synaptic cleft into the outer space. The third method of diffusion is a simple one, but I will go into a little bit on the process of hydrolysis and reuptake. To hydrolyze the neurotransmitters, you need enzymes that I mentioned earlier, that is cholinesterase to break down acetylcholine and monoamine oxidase to break down norepinephrine. Now, once the neurotransmitters are hydrolyzed or oxidized, we find the products of the enzymatic process will be reabsorbed and reused by the synaptic knob. Another way, that is reuptake, does a similar process like hydrolysis, but it starts first with an active process of transporting the neurotransmitters back into the synaptic knob. The 2 enzymes here will be inside the synaptic knob, where the neurotransmitters will be hydrolyzed or oxidized inside the synaptic knob, and the products will be reused immediately. So with that, we conclude today's discussion. We've come to the end of today's video. That is, now you know the structure of the synapse. You also know the roles of 2 neurotransmitters, that is acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And you know how to explain the mechanism of impulse transmission across the synapse. Until my next video, see you soon. Bye-bye.